Now, I did a piece last night about Jacob Rees-Mogg and his attitude to the abolition of the mayoral elections. And if you listen to Jacob Rees-Mogg on the Camilla Tomini's show, you will think British democracy is hanging by a thread. Labour, he says, is running away from voters, mounting a sinister assault on democracy by postponing mayoral elections in Essex, Hampshire, and the Solent, Sussex and Brighton, and Norfolk and Suffolk until 2028. At the same time, he insists it is the duty of Conservatives and Reform to unite in the national interest to prevent a so-called coalition of chaos of Labour, Lib Dems and Greens and assorted independents. So I think one should take this phrase seriously, the duty to put the national interest first. What does it really require here, and who is actually failing that test? So first of all, what Labour has done, and is that lawful, or is that prudent? Two different things. First, the basic facts. The government has announced that the inaugural mayoral elections in 4 combined authority areas, that is Greater Essex, Norfolk and Sussex, Sussex and Brighton, Norfolk and Suffolk, Sussex and Brighton, Hampshire and the Solent, will be pushed back from 2026 to 2028. Ministers say they need more time to complete local government reorganisation and create new unitary councils before handing powers to mayors. This affects millions of voters and comes on top of earlier delays to council elections as part of the same devolution programme. It's also now clear from briefing notes and ministerial statements that by 2028 Labour intends these mayoral contests to operate under a different voting system, more favourable to parties that can pick up second preference votes and less favourable to reform. So legally, where are we? Parliament can move local elections, so it's entirely legal. It has done so in wartime, during the 2001 foot-and-mouth outbreak, and in 2020 during COVID. So it can also change the year of ordinary elections for local authorities and combined authorities by statutory instrument, which is what ministers are now doing. This means this looks lawful in narrow constitutional terms, provided the correct procedures are followed. There may be judicial review threats dressed up as human rights claims or arguments about legitimate expectations, but unless ministers have stepped outside the powers given to them by statute, the courts are likely to say Parliament authorised this, however ugly it looks. So the more important question is not legality, but propriety. And postponing elections for public health or wartime reasons is one thing. Doing so in peacetime with no natural disaster, no cross-party agreement, in areas where polling suggests reform would win all 4 mayoralties is quite another. And it may pass the courtroom test, it fails the smell test. And is it really about the national interest, or is it about Labour's interest? When a government pushes elections back 2 years, the burden of proof is on them. Labour's explanation is administrative, complex devolution, need for robust unitary structures, do it once and do it properly. But the political incentives are screamingly obvious. Reform is currently leading in several of these areas on projected vote share. A reform clean sweep of mayoralities in 2026 would be a visible humiliation for Labour and a visible launch pad for Nigel Farage. Moving the elections to 2028 buys Labour time, but shifts them under a more favourable electoral system. In other words, the decision at least aligns with Labour's partisan interests. That doesn't automatically mean it was taken only for that reason. But in politics, motives are read backwards from outcomes. If you cancel elections in places you are about to lose badly, you cannot be surprised when people talk about voter suppression. So my conclusion is it is wrong, even if it is technically legal. It undermines trust. It encourages every future government to treat electoral timetabling as a tactical variable, not as a fixed democratic commitment. But this is where Jacob Rees-Mogg's sermon about democracy becomes rather awkward. Rees-Mogg speaks as a shocked defender of constitutional principle, yet in 2019 he was leader of the House and a key supporter of Boris Johnson's 5-week prorogation of Parliament at the height of the Brexit crisis. The UK Supreme Court, in Miller and Cherry, held unanimously that the Prime Minister's advice to the Queen was unlawful, void and of no effect because it frustrated Parliament's ability to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification. In that case, the government was not merely shifting the timing of local elections, it was suspending the national legislature in order to escape scrutiny on the most important constitutional decision in half a century. So when Rees-Mogg now says Labour's delay of mayoral elections is a sinister assault on democracy, the obvious reply is, if postponing local elections for 2 years is an assault on democracy, what exactly was unlawfully shutting down Parliament for 5 weeks in 2019? If Rees-Mogg insists that was constitutionally innocent, then this is authoritarian. But this one is authoritarian. Then, to borrow the phrase from Farage, he is hearing what he wants to hear. Rees-Mogg's criticism of Labour on this point is not wrong. The delay is cynical and dangerous, but his record makes him a very poor witness for the prosecution. Now, to the other half of this argument, the supposed duty of Conservatives and Reform to unite in order to stop a coalition of chaos, Rees-Mogg claims the right shares 90% of its opinions and that the real national interest lies in preventing Labour, Lib Dems, Greens and left-wing independents forming a governing bloc. In his account, unity on the right is not a bargain, it's a moral obligation. Now, several problems follow. First, the price of this unity is never openly stated. He hints fairly plainly that Nigel Farage would expect to be Prime Minister in any Tory reform deal on the basis of his personal poll ratings. That would mean a party with no governing experience, minimal internal discipline, no tested cabinet team taking control of the state, with the Conservatives reduced to junior partner status. It's hard to see how installing Farage in Downing Street as part of a hurried fusion between a battered Tory party and a protest vehicle is obviously in the national interest, rather than in the right-wing interest. Second, Rees-Mogg completely inverts the caution he applies to Labour. When Labour shifts election dates to create more favourable context, he calls it a constitutional outrage. When the right proposes to re-engineer the party system and trading the leadership of the government between two factions on a private deal, that is suddenly an act of statesmanship. Either you are against political players trying to lock in their advantages through procedural manoeuvres, or you are not. You cannot condemn one side for keeping power by administrative reforms and then bless the other for doing the same through cartel politics. Third point, the coalition of chaos. This line is logically thin. Every election produces coalitions of some sort, either formal between the parties or informal inside the parties. A Labour, Lib Dem, Green axis might be chaotic, but so might a Conservative Reform coalition, locked in an arms race over migration, culture war and Europe. To claim that one particular configuration of parties is uniquely dangerous, and that this justifies cancelling elections here or stitching up pacts there, is to treat party survival as synonymous with the nation's survival. It's not. The other point that Rees-Mogg raises is the duty to put the national interest first. And I think that is fundamental. It's something that both the current Labour Party and the previous Conservative Party failed to do. So what would it look like to put the national interest first at this moment? At minimum, there are three things. Stop treating the election timetables as partisan property. Labour should never have touched the dates of those mayoral contests. Even if the devolution timetable is messy, the default answer in a democracy is simple. You hold the elections and you make the institutions catch up. If that is administratively uncomfortable for ministers and civil servants, so much the better. It forces them to treat voters as the starting point, not the inconvenience on the way. If Starmer wants to claim the mantle of constitutional repair under the Johnson years, this is exactly the sort of thing he cannot afford to do. Secondly, he needs to be honest, or we need to be honest about what a Tory reform pact really is. If Conservatives and Reform decide to cooperate, they are entitled to do so, but they should describe it honestly as a bargain between parties seeking power, not as some sacramental act in defence of civilization. They should also level with the voters about the price. Who would be Prime Minister? Who would run the Treasury, Home Office, Foreign Office? What is the agreed programme on Europe, migration, tax and the Constitution? At present, Rees-Mogg's language of duty and national interest masks the fact that the pact he sketches is a gamble with enormous constitutional risk. The third point, one test needs to be applied consistently, but does this strengthen or weaken democratic accountability. Cancelling or postponing elections to avert embarrassment weakens our democratic accountability. Unlawfully shutting down Parliament to avoid scrutiny weakens it. Changing electoral systems or boundaries with one eye on the polls weakens it. Allowing voters a genuine choice between competing programmes, even if they choose something you loathe, that is what strengthens it. Measured against that standard, both Labour's mayoral manoeuvre and Rees-Mogg's romantic vision of a right-wing unity government fall short. Each in different ways puts party advantage ahead of the long-term health of the system. So, is Jacob Rees-Mogg right to be angry about the postponement of mayoral elections? Yes, in part. It's imprudent, self-serving and corrosive, even if a court ultimately decides it's lawful. If we want to have these major coalitions, then maybe we need to start thinking about proportional representation rather than the first-past-the-post system. We need to change the electoral procedure. But Rees-Mogg is not the constitutional conscience of the nation, and we need to remember that as well. A man who cheer-led an unlawful prorogation that silenced Parliament for 5 weeks is in no position to present himself as the sole defender of democratic norms, charming though he may be. The deeper problem is everyone in this drama is talking about the national interest, and almost nobody is honestly talking about their own interest. Labour dresses up electoral engineering as technocratic reform. The right dresses up proposed carve-ups between Conservatives and Reform as a moral crusade against chaos. Sometimes, as Farage said in a different context, people hear what they want to hear. The task now for voters, for commentators, and ideally for some politicians, is to listen past the rhetoric and ask a simple question of every manoeuvre. Does this make it easier for citizens, for subjects, to choose and to remove their rulers, or harder? And on that test, neither side emerges with clean hands.